we're all traveling through this experiment together. We all have different areas that we may struggle with. We all have areas where, you know, despite, as James taught last week, despite our rational mind's desire to, you know, to improve our state in life, our emotional brain doesn't want to. It's just looking for that short-term gratification. So anyway, I would just encourage everyone to keep, you know, even if you fall down, you don't do the practices for a couple days, no big deal. Get right back into it. You know, eventually we'll get there. And to that point, that's where Anurag keeps saying that architecture environment, which is the conversation we're having this month, and we'll probably consider into next month, continuing that topic forward, is one of the most important conversations we can be having. And we all know that reality is constituted through language and through conversation. So, you know, if we can't get the architecture of our life organized, structure will always win, and we won't be able to shift things. So it's vital. With that being said, I want to introduce our guest speaker this morning. And I'm just going to, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the bio that was posted a couple weeks ago, I want to introduce you to Matt Taylor, who's a dear friend and work colleague. We're working on some projects together. He's got 60 years designing, building, facilitating, teaching, writing, and researching as an integrated design practice, and has applied to a wide variety of projects in architecture, construction, graphics, work furniture, alternative futures modeling, work processes, organizational structure and practices, collaborative design, the configuration and use of complex technology systems for computers and multimedia and buildings. He's a co-designer and holder of the patent system for optimizing interaction among agents acting on multiple levels. His present primary focus is in documenting the knowledge that has been gained through 60 years of work and transferring it to individuals and organizations that are interested in going beyond only profit and personal satisfaction to build a future-ready society. You're going to hear him talk a bit about that today. Matt believes that research, design, building, and the use of environments, how perfect for the architecture of environment conversations we've been having, that the use of these environments can preserve all life and the planet, support human transformation, while also being works of art and can be realized at affordable time and cost. Matt studied architecture with Frank Lloyd Wright and Bruce Goff from 1956 through to 1970. His work is augmented by intensive personal study with mentors and with a focus on cybernetics and systems. And just some of his clients over the many years include the U.S. Army, NASA, the U.S. Air Force, Boeing, Ernst & Young. He's worked with the World Economic Forum, Columbia University, and several others. This morning, he's going to be talking about how architecture isn't just what we all sort of immediately think it is. You know, we think it's this building or this functional space we're sitting in the middle of. But quite beyond that, architecture is in its purest and most truest sense, laden with the values inherent in terms of what it means to be human. And there's this very spiritual and metaphysical aspect to architecture. And when you're listening to him this morning, I want you to really think about the architecture of our individual lives. We talked about the 4 types of architecture. There's physical architecture, such as buildings and homes and automobiles and spaces, right, that we physically exist in. There's also cognitive architecture. There's emotional architecture, and there's spiritual architecture. And Matt's going to be touching on all of those as he goes through his talk this morning. So I'm going to be supporting him this morning as well. I'll be sharing my screen with the presentation that he's created for us, and he'll be leading the conversation. So without further ado, Matt, say hi to everybody. We'll have more people joining us as they dial in from wherever they are in the world. But over to you.
Well, hello. Nice to be with you. Can you hear me clearly?
We can, yeah.
Yeah. You going to play that little tape, are you?
Yeah, I've got it. You should be able to see my screen share.
Yeah, I'm showing my age when I say tape.
Okay, so we'll start with the video then?
Yeah.
All right, here we go. also being works of art and can be realized at affordable time and cost. Matt studied architecture with Frank Lloyd Wright and Bruce Goff from 1956 through to 1970. His work is augmented by intensive personal study with mentors and with a focus on cybernetics and systems. And just some of his clients over the many years include the U.S. Army, NASA, the U.S. Air Force, Boeing, Ernst & Young. He's worked with the World Economic Forum, Columbia University, and several others. This morning, he's going to be talking about how architecture isn't just what we all sort of immediately think it is. You know, we think it's this building or this functional space we're sitting in the middle of. But quite beyond that, architecture is in its purest and most truest sense, laden with the values inherent in terms of what it means to be human. And there's this very spiritual and metaphysical aspect to architecture. Okay.
Okay, let's slide down to, what is it, slide 3.
Yep.
Let me give you a little background and a little bit of a hint why I wanted to start with that particular project. After I take you through some of that and point out some of the deep reasons why it is the way it is, we'll also look at a Frank Lloyd Wright house that was designed about the time I was born, some 80 years ago, and is still a viable environment.
And just to be clear, Matt's internet has been going on and off. So he said it dips out for a few seconds and then it comes back. So it's just dipped out. So we'll just give him a second and it'll come back on. We do have a backup if it goes on too long like this. He'll call in by phone. We were testing this morning. Yeah, let's see here. Just give us 1 second here. We were testing this morning and seemed to be okay, and then some weather came in. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now, yep.
Okay, I just switched over to satellite.
All right, let me put your presentation back up here.
Yeah, and she's gonna check the cable.
Okay.
reviewed the cable. We've been having some extreme weather out here in California. You might have noticed after 6 years of drought, we just about filled all the aquifers up in 2 months. You know, so anyway, so we will go through these and then take these two examples and pull some principles about what architecture is and isn't, and what its scope is, which as Chad has already started to talk about, is much wider than what people think about architecture and what the practice of architecture today is being responsible for and is competent to execute. A little short bio on me. I was born in 1938 to an Air Force family, and of course went through World War II with all of that business, and got interested in architecture at a very young age when I was about 10 years old, and said that's going to be my life, and stayed with that all the way to my junior year and through my junior year in high school. And I got a job in an architect's office, and I took it, and I've never been back to a school or a college except for to teach since then, because I went to the masters of architecture that I could find at the time. I learned. I went into construction and built multi-story buildings in New York City and whole cities, sun cities in Arizona. And every single time I got rather quickly to the top of being a chief draftsman, a designer. I went into construction and became then a project engineer. And then I went into graphics and other fields. In other words, I kept about every 6, 7, 8 years changing professions and finding out everything I could that seemed to develop towards a process of architecture. We'll get into a little bit more of that later, but now let's just take a look at some of these slides. Give you a background of this building. At the end of World War II, Italy, of course, was not on the right side of the argument for two reasons, philosophically, and the second is they lost. And they had a problem. Every single bank in Italy was fascist and operated by the fascist regime, which, remember, the army surrendered. The fascist people didn't necessarily surrender, and they had lots of integration in banks around the world. And so what they decided to do in Italy was very interesting. As you may know, if you've lived in Italy, and I think it's true of a lot of older European nations, Italy has different regions, and they have their own name, their own philosophies, their own identities. You know, these people do the rice, these people do the chocolate, these people manufacture Fiats, these people, you know, and those regions, they set up a nonprofit in each one of those regions and gave them the banks. And they said, okay, you can do anything you want. You can operate them, you can sell them, you can sell stock in them, you can take them public, you can do anything you want. But here's what you must do. All the money that you make from the banks, you must put into the arts, education, social welfare, and things like that. So they established this system that was throughout all of Italy. One of the banks is called Unicredit. And Unicredit, at the time that they hired me, was the largest bank in Italy and the 4th largest in Europe. And most of their expansion outside of Italy was towards the communist era banks that had started when the breakdown of the Soviet Union, that opened up a lot of opportunities. And so they started buying and trading with those banks, and that's how they got to be so large. Well, they needed a place to bring people together and to talk and to learn about how this, because they had people speaking in different languages and everything, and they wanted a place. They wanted to build it in Milan, where their home office is, but it turned out that the nonprofit that owned them, and still at that point still owned, I don't know if a majority, but a very large minority of the stock, had this place in Turin. And they said, no, it has to be Turin. And in Turin was this old building, 18th century building, a block long and half a block wide. And what you're going to see is just sort of the block by block, but you'll see some things that hint that there's elevators that go up and a whole another part of the building. And they was completely refurbished the building inside with air conditioning and all new electrical and everything. And they wanted to create this center. And because I had written a paper that somehow it found itself around through Europe about economics and social development and the distribution of work and wealth and things like that, they called me. And so we created this environment. Now, at the time, Fiat was the major employer in the region, or had been. And Fiat was running into economic difficulties, and they had a new CEO who was pulling them back on their feet. And you think of Fiat maybe as little cars, but if you look at your history, they build big cars, luxurious cars. They build as many different kinds of brands as any car company in the world, maybe more. They built airplanes, they built trains, a very big industrial enterprise that was going through the changes of this period of time. So the region around Turin had decided that they needed, because industrial was changing so fast, that they needed to become a design-focused region research and design and education and manufacturing, and tie all these things together. Now, basically, this was a very wise thing, because we're talking about the intellectual part, the mind part, the creative part, the research part, the hands part, the making part, the complete creative process. And so they had us build this environment. Why don't you go to the slide 4. Now, what you're looking at here, now go down to slide 5, is a space that is 3 stories high. We're talking 3 European stories, and European stories are quite a bit higher than American stories generally, and particularly in the old architecture. This building is all stone, and it's a beautiful building, and it's been there, and it's on their list of buildings you can't mess up. In other words, it's historic. It has a dome. You'll see it in a picture over the top. That was the first glass and concrete dome of its type ever built in the world. And there had been a bank at one point. And the company that owns all the banks, the nonprofit, is on the 3rd floor. This building, this part that you see, is 2 stories high, but there's all the way up multiple stories. Actually, this project had actually the banks on the 2nd floor had the 3rd floor, and that floor goes a whole block long, and you won't see a picture of that, but there's a lot of stuff going on, just like what you're seeing here. Go to the next one. Now, what you'll see as we go through this is a space where nearly 400 people can sit and have a dialogue with one another. And there's a system, you'll see a picture looking out from this system, where all this is captured. They have a room almost the size of a small house that that we designed for them, which is all electronic storage. And they can take from 40 different, they can broadcast down to 40 screens, and they can take from multiple cameras. If you look closely, and I'll talk about this in a second, it's all up in that wood structure, cameras, lights, and inside that wood structure is 3.5 miles of wire. Because every light, every device, every plug, every computer, everything that is electronic in that building runs hardwire back to a panel where it can be controlled by a professional editing system like you would see if you went into CNN and looked at their looked at their recording and production system. And that is up on a level. If you look in the center of the drawing you're looking at, you see that column going up and there's a ring, and then you see above that what looks like a little square. That's actually the window that looks out from that production facility. So while people are working, whether they're working on white walls, whether they're just sitting in a team, whether they're all together having a conversation, they can see each other's work, they can get work, and the work can be edited and research done on it and sent back to them. So what you have here, and there's 40 screens, some of them projections, some of them rolling, some of them big electronic screens. And what you have here, you don't look at media in the space, you are in media. And that media is interactive in real time and feeding back, because there's a staff of people that's what they're doing as people are working on various things. Let's go to slide 7. Now, another thing here that is interesting, you see the picture in the upper left-hand corner. That's one of 2 or 3 very large screens. It's projection, there's a projector behind it that's up in what we call the armature piece, and you'll see more of that in a second. And these people are on a cantilevered steel and glass balcony, of which there's 2. There's one here and there's one over on the left. When I say balcony and when I say steel and glass, the floor is glass, the rail is glass. There's just small amounts of steel that's holding it up, and on either side of it, there's elevators that go up to the upper floors, and they're all glass. And so what you're looking at there is the kind of architecture that if you go out to almost any city in the world now is being built, very modern, very slick, very cold, very aesthetic kind of architecture, which standing alone is usually rather depressing. And it's inside. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a little bit of that dome over the top. This happens to be at night when that was taken. You'll see another one in the day, and what you'll see is the light coming down through that dome. And so you have this not Baroque architecture, but classic architecture as it was at the turn of the, say, the last 30, 40 years of the 18th century. And then inside of this, where you see all the wood, you see what is classic organic architecture, where it's wood, it's touchable, it's movable, you can reconfigure it, and so on. Go on to the next one, 8. Now, this is up on that glass balcony. You don't see the rail, but it's right in front of you. Look carefully and look along the bottom. You'll see that there's a lighter vertical things. That's where the glass just butts together, it just has a slight thing. And when you're up there, you're looking straight down and straight through, and you're looking into that big room, and you're looking up into the upper room. Now, as that tape talked about, what you're looking at here is 3 different structural systems. This piece inside is literally one piece of furniture. And that's where all the wires go through. And it's also self-supporting and sitting on 12 columns that come down. And those 12 columns, of course, are bolted to the floor, and they have to be engineered for seismic and anything like that. But other than that, they do not touch the building in any way. And what you see, let's see, go down to the next one. Let's see, go down to, go to 5. Can you go to 5? Yeah. What you're looking here is running 2 sets of what's called a simple truss. If you look at old railroad trusses, the triangles, right? Beam on the top, beam on the bottom, and triangles. That's a simple truss. That's one of the oldest forms of engineering around. And then if you go to back to 8. Now, when you look at this, you will see, if you look through there, you'll see the truss running through. But notice that sitting on the truss are these arms from the center of the truss, these arms that go out like this. And you see the cables that are going up and down. The cables are going out to this ring you see all the way around. This ring is 75 feet in diameter. In other words, think about a house that was 75 feet by 75 feet and 3 stories high. You get an idea of what you're looking at here. Now, this ring is held up by the cables that come from the center of the truss, go out, over, and down and around. And you'll see these in other pictures. And they pick up this ring. This ring is not held by anything by that. And then let's see, if you go to slide, let's see. Yeah, go to slide 10. Now, over on the left, you can see the truss going across. And then right in front of you, what looks like a column, and it's a column that goes up and it becomes an arch. And that arch, all those arches, there's 8 of them, go around and they come to the center of the truss. Now, what we're looking at here is the 3 primary structural systems of traditional building: a simple truss, dome-like arches, and suspension. Now, why? Why do it that way? Well, inside this truss is where all the electronics are running, is where all the lighting is, not all of it, but a great deal of it is. It's the sound speakers, they're embedded cameras. There are cameras that move around, but there's actually cameras that can pick up anywhere and can be controlled and you can pick up. So if I'm talking on this side, and by the way, when you have those 400 people, there's never more than 10 rows. So they're relatively close to whatever is going on in the center. And so if I'm over here and I'm talking to someone over on the other side, the screens can show them and me, and we can, of course, hear one another, and we can have a dialogue. And so literally 400 people can sit down and have a dialogue. Now, in a collaborative process, you only do that once or twice a day, most of the time you're in smaller teams working together and solving things. But this is where you come back and have a conversation. And so because we're in a town that is moving as a tradition that goes back well more than 2 or 3 centuries, and who has expertise embedded in mechanics, engineering, systems, building complex vehicles and other things. We wanted for them to have an environment that reminded them as they look at it, whether they think about it or not, and we'll get to that in a moment. Remember, what you think you're thinking about and what's really going on in your head is 2 very different things. And what they're seeing is inside this historic building, and they're seeing a structure which is obviously functional, but as the history of their profession, but in a new way, in a new, more human and exciting and touchable way. And so that's the metaphor. And there's one other thing about it that's important. If you have a beam, and this is called, you know, where the two ends is supported, what the beam wants to do is this. It's called deflection. And where it lands here at the column, it's called shear. All right. So what's happening is that in this case, you notice all those wires that are holding all that mass going around the outside, they're coming down to the center. Now, as the outer ring wants to fail, the wires, the cables, which are about the size of my pinky, all come together and pull that deflection back up. And so the beams go across, they are held from lateral pressure by the arches that go to them, because a beam, when it fails, wants to twist. You ever see a building burn down? You'll see when the structure fails, it twists. It's called moment. And so what you have here is a structure that any of those three elements alone would fail. But together, they are creating a composite structure which could take an earthquake. And so, again, not everybody knows that, but you sense that when you're in the building, that we're talking about how do different parts, different ideas, different things come together and create an organic whole. Everything that you touch and move around is wood, and inside there's furniture. It all rolls, it stacks, it goes down an elevator, it comes back up. You can have these people all sitting here and in a conversation like this, and within minutes, they are out and about and going into breakouts where, and it's done like this within a few minutes. And so the space is constantly being set up all day long. If you ran a movie, it's like it's changing all the time as people are doing their work. Let's see, go to 12, please. So this was the announcement in La Stampa about the opening of this. And you can't see very well the screen of the picture. I have the original picture, but I couldn't find it last night. But this, where you see the person that is more clear, that's the CEO of the bank. And to the right, as you look at it, that's me. And to the right of me is the translator. And to the left in the corner is the mayor of the town. And the people that you see filling up this room are all from the entire region, the religious, philosophical, educational, business leaders, people representing farming, manufacturing, unions. In other words, a picking up of all the people that will be using the center. And this was the day that we, in a sense, said, we have built this for you, as well as for UniCredit. Now, let's go down to slide 11, please. This is not something that we will emphasize a great deal in this talk, but it's important. I live in California, the sixth largest economy in the world. California, one state. It's an innovative place, as we all know, Silicon Valley and everything. The teachers in San Francisco and Oakland and the Bay Area cannot afford to live in the city they teach in. We have the largest homeless in the United States of America, the richest state in the United States of America. And the cost and the time to put in buildings. So we tend to think of architecture as just the pretty picture in the building. All the infrastructure, the lines underneath, everything, all of those are architectural elements. The picture on the lower left is, I was hired and worked with the Unicredit architects and made the design in January, February of '06. And they hired a design build firm called Permis de Lisa, wonderful French, Italian firm, does brilliant work. And they put, from my design, their architects on it, their engineers, and they had to completely rebuild this building from the bottom up. And so it took them until October till they knew where all the dimensions were, and they were far enough ahead. This picture on the left is the night that I arrived and we shipped from the United States of America the first of our wooden structure, our armature structure. The picture to the right of that, as you look at it, are people doing the final cleanup one day before opening, and that was January 5. So from November to January 5, this entire space, we did our final engineering, our manufacturing, and our shipping in containers, and erected while the other work was still going on around by the contractor of record. And that is normally something that people would have messed with for a long, long time. So what we're talking about here is not architecture in the sense of drawing something, putting it out to bid, and then supervising someone from a distance. Permis de Lisa had 2 architects and 3 engineers in an office there. We had our people, and we built 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we erected this entire structure. We had drawings, we had engineering going in, but the complexity of what you're seeing here is such that there's no way it could have been done on drawings alone. It had to be done by a collaborative process of about 60 people working on all levels of craftsmanship. And we had to make changes as we learned things, saw things, and also saw opportunities. And we had to stay within a budget. Now, Brad, if you will go back up there a second, just go up, Chad, just go up and, no, up, please. Yeah, back up to the first number 3. Now let's quickly go through it. What you're seeing on the left is the columns that I talked about, which off of them go the arches. Now, obviously that column would not stay stable, send you a beam that's 35 feet long, right? Except for it's held by the truss. But the truss would not be stable if that wasn't there stopping it from twisting. And what you see coming on either side of that is that ring that goes all the way around. And on the right-hand picture here, you see some of the screens that are around. And the first setup, this was actually the day before when we were testing, getting ready for people to come in. So go down to, go to 4. Now you see we have 3 of these pods. These pods are whatever you want them to be. When you move its skin to open to go in, there's a turntable. And you can sit there and turn a crank, and you can turn your pod so that it's looking in or out. It can be part of what's on the other side or part of this side. And if you look at the tops, those can close and open. But this isn't done electronically. It's done like a ship, raising your sails or lowering your sails. It actually has lines, little tie-offs, just like ships, and you turn the pod by hand and you move your screens by hand. There's 3 of these, and they all orient to different parts of the work. The team that's using them, it could be a bunch of designers with a table in there, or it could be people doing the knowledge work, doing the editing, doing the graphics and stuff like that. But that's one part of it. Now go down to the next one, please, number 5. Now you see occasionally what looks like a big wall, and it is. When we opened up the space, we went into another space, and there was a building about 20 feet, and there was an alley, and we opened up what were the big windows, made them into just open arches, and we just went all the way out, and that's under a big greenhouse roof. And if we now go down to 6, now go to 7, there. What you see here in the lower left-hand corner is one of those pods, and you go up on a shelf, a step which is on the side. And if you look through, you'll see a garden. And if you look at the lower right-hand corner, there is the edge of that garden. That garden actually goes for about 30 feet. It goes through where those windows used to be, which are now arches, and it's underneath a greenhouse roof. And those are real planted plants. Those aren't, potted plants. They are growing in soil, and it has a river running through a sound. So you can be in this large, busy area that we looked at before, and you walk, and you can walk right into the silent area. There's benches and places. This is called prospect and refuge. There has to be prospect, which you look out and see what's the opportunity, and there has to be refuge, the quiet corner where you have your cup of coffee, where you think in the morning, where you work on your notebook, where you just maybe have a conversation or a dialogue. Okay. Now go down to, we've seen 8, go down, we've seen 9, go down to 10. Just another piece here. But if you looked in the picture on the lower right hand, if I turned around, if I was up on the balcony, which is right above my head, if you look right up above, you'll see there's like a shadow there. That's that balcony where those 2 people were looking out over into the space. Well, on the back side of this is the backside door to the courtyard, and you can just see the corner of that balcony in this upper left-hand corner of the glass. And so this environment here is just feet away. What I'm trying to stress is the space itself has different places which are designed for different kinds of interactions among people. This is the library, which if you see in the corner on that picture, it rolls. It actually rolls, so it's quite a large number of books can be rolled around. And so making it adaptable is the important thing. So go down to now, let's see. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about, just one other thing. Yeah, can't remember. So go down to slide 13, please. We won't have time to get into this tonight, but as I spent my first 20 years in construction and design and building environments, and learning how to compress the time by better than 50% and to take 30, 40% of the cost out. And this involved multi-million-dollar buildings in New York and whole cities, Sun City in Arizona, because I found out that if you could get people to act in a collaborative, working way, not as an architect that gets 10% for designing, turning over to a contractor who gets 10%, for hiring a bunch of subcontractors who get 10% for doing their work, and then they hire people who actually does the work, and you are already 4 levels of organization before someone drives a nail or picks up a brick, and you spend 30 to 40% of your money on information and design and people looking at one another. So everything that I did always was design, build, use, to actually integrate that, not as one organization legally, but to bring people from all those organizations and creating a way of working together that people actually made more money, but spent far less, and it cost far less to the client, and we got a higher quality of work. Now, after doing that in the 70s is when I started thinking about the future and did a course on designing the future. And I met my wife, Gail, who was doing work called the Learning Exchange, which was an organization to facilitate and improve and make viable education. And we met each other, fell in love, got married, and we started a company called MG Taylor. And in that company, we created a way of collaborative work where we could cut the time, the cost, the confusion, all of the conflicts, because like when we worked on the 777 Boeing, we brought in everybody that was involved. We would work with groups of 150 at a time, and we would design our way through all of these complications, including government regulation, engine companies, even competitors who would have to coordinate and work together in order to make the testing process less expensive. We did it on an Air Force base, which required a law passed through Congress, and they got paid full market price, but that helped this base, which was a testing facility. And so by bringing broken pieces together, we have found that people can do this. But the question that comes up to us now is why? And so why is, in my mind, what we call right livelihood. And this little Venn diagram shows the things in why that have to be understood in order to have harmony rather than conflict. And in a sense, what we're talking about here is how we create strong memory in the mind and how we create this collaborative process. And so this is for another subject, but we'll come back to it. What you see on the top is one of our models. Over a 40-year period, this book, which is just recently published, this is our dictionary, our language. It's called the modeling language. Terms of art of how to do this kind of work. And this is, of course, what was patented by the US government many, many years ago now, over 20 years ago. And so in this cube, one is a diagram of the creative process, stages you go through. One is the diagram of design formation, program, schematic, preliminary, engineering, etc. And one is vantage points, philosophy, culture, all the way down. I won't get into that, but the point is all of those are different places that people come from. And when you bring two people together, if one person is speaking philosophically and the other person is speaking logistically, and they don't understand that, they argue. If you have someone who is in the schematic stage of understanding what's going on and another person who's sitting there saying, you know, where's the engineering? Where's the engineering? You have these arguments. And so by understanding how we can know where we are and we can see the values we want to achieve, that's how we smooth out and remove the friction in a process of people who may come together, like this building that I just showed you. All these people came together for a total of 9 months, each working at different times, and then have never worked together again. And yet they remember that project, and they'll remember it for the rest of their lives. Now, if we go down to the next one, 14. This is a house built in 1936, 37, 38. It was built by the owners themselves. And it was a Frank Lloyd Wright house, and it's called a Usonian, which was his term for USA. And he designed in the 30s small, little wooden, stone brick houses with heated floors, organic, sitting in a landscape like they grew out of it. And they were $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 houses. If you go and just say inflation, according to MoMA, this house would have cost $110,000 today. It's not true. It's what it should cost. That's the dollar value, but there's not the craftsman that built these houses. But he designed these houses. Sometimes we apprentices would go out and build one. Sometimes a contractor would do it. Usually he had 1 or 2 contractors that go around the country. And sometimes the owners would build these houses. Now, if you go down to the next one, 15. This is the front of the house, and it's a garage. Go back up now to 14. 14. This is the back of the house, which is looking out over one of the Great Lakes. And if you then go down to 16, this is the inside of the house. Now, this is built, of course, in an area that gets very cold. They had floor heating, which was a little bit of an innovation of his time. Actually, Wright learned about that in Japan when he built the Imperial Hotel. And when I was at Taliesin, which was his home and workshop, in Wisconsin, it has a farm where we did our own farming, and we cut our own wood, and we built our own buildings. And in Arizona, it was out in the desert, and the same kind of thing, but we didn't have the farming. But we'd spend the winters in Arizona, and we'd spend the summers in Wisconsin, go back and forth. And all of us young wannabe architects would, as we went back and forth, go all over the country to try to find one of the 500 houses that Wright had built over a nearly 70-year period of time. And we'd knock on the door, and the owners would, oh yes, it's that time of year, and they'd let us in to feed us breakfast and tell us about the house, and it was wonderful. And all that I'm telling you is very important. There is no great architecture without a great client owner. It doesn't happen, all right? It does not happen. You can't take one piece out of a system as complex as this. And when you see it all broken up with different regulators and different architects who can do this, but they can't do that. Actually, I am not an architect. I never took my license because it would have stopped me from doing what I do. I'm not a contractor, and I'm not a developer. I do all those functions. Okay. And of course, when we pull together a team, we always have an architect of record. Whenever you go, every state, you have to have a different architect of record, right? And there's no architect I know that has a license to practice everywhere in the world, all right? So the point is, you pull your team together, you don't hire your contractor after you have the drawings. You have your contractors and subcontractors working with you doing the drawings so you can do it more efficiently and more beautifully and more effectively. And so we were sitting here, right here. I'm young. This was 1958. I was born in 38. I'm 20 years old. And And I said to Mrs. Pugh, this is the Pugh house, P-E-W. I said, and she had been living there about 20 years by that time. And I said, what's it like to live in a Frank Lloyd Wright house? And she said, oh, when I first moved in, I hated it. I hated it. And I just, oh, what? What? Why? And she said, I thought that Mr. Wright did not design a house for me. I thought that he designed a house that he wanted. And I resented it. And I fought the house. And I didn't like the house. And I said, well, gee, you know, what did you do? She said, well, we actually considered selling it. It's on the market now for $1.5 million, I think. She said, I thought to sell it. Now, you have to understand, because Wright was so controversial, of the 500 houses he built, not one, to my knowledge, was ever funded by a government system, you know, like, what is this, Somebody May, and there's two of them that lend out loans for houses, or a bank. So for a young couple that were middle class to build this $7,000 house, whatever it was, and try to sell it or have to sell it, it would just have been disaster.
It's 9 o'clock.
And by the way, in 1975, someone wrote a book outlining every Wright house that had ever been built from 1880 to 60, 65, because he had 50 houses in our drafting room when he died in 1959. And so it took a couple, 2 or 3 years to build the last of them. Some in cases, 10 years. 75% of them had the original owner and or family still owning the house. Just recently, a number of houses have hit the market, which were the last people that actually commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to build him a house. And he's been dead since 1959. In the United States, we buy and sell houses every time we move 10 feet. Yeah, but when people got a Wright house, they kept it. They fell in love with it. But anyway, I asked her, what are you going to do? That would be a disaster. And she said, most brilliant response. She said, I will give the house 1 year and not fight. I will just let the house speak to me. And she said, at the end of the year, I realized 2 things. One, I loved the house, and I'm not even comfortable going to other people's houses. And by the way, if you ever have a chance, a lot of these are B&B houses now. And it's true, when you spend time in these, you look at it, you see the architecture, say, okay, that's nice. But it's the time, it's the feeling, it's the sense, it's the way it embraces nature. It is the way that it gives you this prospect and refuge. It's the feeling of it, the textures of it, the smell. That's what's real and physical about these houses. And then she said the thing that changed my life. She said, I realized that Mr. Wright did not design a house for me. He designed a house for the me that I could become. And this gets to the point, who was it, Winston Churchill? You know, we build our buildings and then they build us. The point is that architecture it synthesizes the philosophy, the feeling, the meaning, the aspiration, with a structure which has to perform in a certain way, in the organization of space and materials and tools. And if it does this as an integrated way that you can't take one away from the other, then you have a masterwork of architecture. And you see very little of that kind of architecture today. Now go down to 12. I know we're running late and we'll be done soon. What happened? 12. Oh.
Oh, you mean 17?
Oh, is that 17?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the trouble with 80-year-old eyes. Oh, yeah. Okay. You put us up that big. All right. Now, don't think that what I'm talking about has to be flat, has to be square, has to be anything. This is a geodesic sphere, and you come out with several hundred pieces on a flatbed truck, and you dig a base, a wood foundation, you dig a pit for your greenhouse, and then you put this on it. It'll erect in 2 or 3 days. And even inside, the floor in some places just curves up, and you're sitting there walking up and sitting in a clustered area looking down. It takes away the flat earth view that architecture gives us. And it starts to give us other ways of seeing the world. And when you take it away, it all pulls apart, goes back into the flat truck, and you smooth the earth back, and you haven't touched anything. And it's totally independent of power. It's got its own power, solar, water, everything. It grows food. It has a fish tank. So this, I designed this in 1966 and it's being rebuilt because we're thinking about taking it out to Burning Man. And saying, well, you know, you like to do big pieces of sculpture. How about this one that you can live in? All right, the last one, I think, 18. Now, this is a little piece out of my notebook, the picture. And what I'm encouraging you to do, as you think about architecture, and we'll talk a little bit more about architecture, mind and brain and levels of recursion, et cetera. But as you think about your course and you think about architecture and all the other subjects you will take, I really encourage you to have a notebook and not to scribble in, but to think and put your thoughts in and date them. And don't fill up every page. When I do a notebook, I always leave the left-hand side open. Sometimes I go across, but I usually leave it open so I can come back 5 years, look what I read, which the me that comes back in 5 years isn't the me that wrote it. And I can then write more. And my notebooks, which would stack to the ceiling, are the history of my life and work. And I want to talk about hand. 25, it's estimated, 25% of the neural system in your hand is connected to the neurons in your brains. We know now that reading a book engages one part of your brain. Reading the same book electronically engages another part of your brain. That the way that we physically react in our space, in our place, affects our brain. Our brain is connected to our closest friends, you know, entanglement is called, right? It's our memory. When you think about how often you said, oh yeah, that piece of music. Oh yeah, remember our little red Ford convertible, and we were down at the beach when we met? That's, memory isn't shelves. Memory is this big, vast, complex system. And literally, and this is the important thing, when you start to work or think about something, you literally create a workspace. The brain creates a workspace, and it starts to pull in all the things into that workspace. And then you become aware of it, and you dialogue with it, and you speak, and you watch things go out and you watch things come in, but most of what's going on in your mind, you're not aware of directly and you cannot control. It is a huge, vast, complex architecture. Your brain is probably as complex as New York City. And so you can't force that mind any more than you could force making a great building. It is the assembly and the awareness of the different parts. One more thing about the hand, and it connects this. If you were standing by a balcony or a hill or something, and there was this big pipe, say it was a hot steam pipe, and you started to fall, well, let's back up. If you were just standing there and you just casually reached over and grabbed the pipe, what would you do? You'd immediately let go, right? You'd immediately let go, because if you held on, you would burn your hands. But here's the problem with this, and this was something I mused through in my early 20s when I was trying to figure out cybernetics and systems and mind-brain theory and algorithms for computers and things like that. The problem is with that is that the time it takes the message, and your neural system is fast, but the time it takes the message for that hot, this is too hot. If it had to go all the way up to here, decision made, all the way down, let go, you would burn your hand severely. The decision is actually made right about here. But if that pipe was between you and 400 feet drop, what do you think you'd do? You'd hold on to it. Now, and those are facts. If there's not time to get to the brain, what tells you to hold on? Because the brain knows that about the 400 feet, this doesn't. So when you start looking through all of this, and this is what scientists have done in the last several years, they've stopped the bifurcations. They understand that animals are very intelligent and solve problems and have languages. They understand that things like trees communicate and intervene and send supplies to one another when they have a tree. We are surrounded by redwood trees out this back, and they support one another as they go around, and they send nutrients. And if a young redwood tree is growing too fast, which makes it dangerous because it'll fall over, they'll send branches around it to shade it from the sun. Very intelligent. There's now a major university research group that has a visiting professor who's a slime mold. He's got his own space and everything. I don't know if it's he or she, but anyway, it's a slime mold. And the slime mold is being accepted as a colleague. Now, they can't directly talk with it, but they've learned how to give the slime mold challenges, to watch how the slime mold solves it, because it turns out that the slime mold can solve problems at the same rate and scale and scope as we can. They are very smart. And as we all know, they break up into little pieces, and then they come together to become a slime mold so they can go somewhere and then get into a different situation. They break up into little pieces. But at the same time, it's almost like a brain without all the rest of the baggage. Octopi, very intelligent. So we're learning these things. We're learning that, I think of architecture. This is an architecture. This is an architecture. When I get to here, this is another level of recursion, another scale of architecture. And they don't always agree. They argue. Matter of fact, even in here, argue. You ever have a good argument with yourself? Right? These are complex, sophisticated systems that engage, sometimes argue, but more or less work together. And then there's 4 or 5 of us sitting around, and we're a group, and we're working on a project. And we have to work through all of that, and that's an architecture. And we get to our neighborhood, Our family, that's an architecture. We get to a city, architecture. We get to the ecology of the planet, architecture. And we go out into space. Here's my argument. It's all the same system. I have spent literally since I was 10 years old, when I sat down and read the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was sort of crazy, took a while, all right? Pulling these pieces together, building models, going out and testing them. If this model is right, we should take half the time off building this 25-story building in New York City. All right. We built two of them actually in 14 months. Block-long building, 25 stories high. All right. Because we approached it differently. And that wasn't just testing a way to build. That was, we were creating a mind-like organization. So here's the model. We can kind of troubleshoot it, think about it, observe it, play with it, and we can use it as a model. We can create language around it. We can look at science. We can look at philosophy. We can look at religions. Some of those ancient religions turned out to be pretty smart about what they were talking about. If we can look at the geometries of the pyramids. Do you know that just about all of those old monuments in the United States of America, the big Inca arguments, the pyramids, China, all out, same geometry. It's the golden mean, which the Greeks sort of made famous, the Fibonacci series and everything. The Greeks made famous, but of course, the founder of the mathematics spent 20 years in Egypt. And so all of these old ideas and these different cultures and civilizations that came and went, and when you look at what some of these civilizations knew and what they still know, and you look at the fact that they faded away, some destroyed themselves, and you look at where we are today, are we acting organically? Are we stewarding our world? You know, Gail and I's subject is, our mission is to create processes, architectures, you might call it, learning systems, you might call it, for Earth as Earth as a planet Earth as a garden and as a work of art for all life, not just the humans who happen to have the power to wipe things out.
And Matt, let me interject there for a few minutes here, because I want to. No, it's fine. I want to. So this is actually part one in a part two that I'm going to pick up next month. And when I invited Matt to join us to chat, and I've known Matt for a number of years now, and we have great conversation. And my experience whenever I get the opportunity to sit down with him and we have one of our conversations is I sit, and for me the experience is always one of, you know, so you talk about architecture, Matt. I want everyone to think. So some of you are thinking probably, okay, how do I relate Matt's experience as an architect building buildings? What does it have to do with my being? Consider that all of us as individual human beings, as an architecture of cognitive architecture, emotional architecture, spiritual architecture, physical architecture. Each one of those architectures are complex systems that interrelate to constitute who I am. And yet, how aware are any of us at any point in time of the interrelationship between these four architectural elements? Any one of them we could spend an entire year just trying to talk about and understand. And yet we go out and we live this life being completely unaware of how these elements that constitute my being, we are in the being experiment this year, Not giving much attention is the average person does not give much attention to who they are and why they are designed the way they are. And if they did, they would have an inkling or an understanding of what they need to actually do to shift who they're being by starting to shift the different architectural elements that design them. I look at the world and I say, there's the universe, and I am manifesting in thought, which then becomes a manifestation in physical reality that I then experience recursively as me. When Matt is talking about keeping a journal or a book, and look at, this is the one that I picked up that I'm going to start working through. Who are you? Lewis Carroll asked the question to Alice, who are you? When we talk about the nature of being and the being experiment, one of the challenge that I'm putting forth this year for everybody is to not assume anything as static in terms of who you are, but rather that you have the ability to change, that we are all organic systems. We've been learning a lot about how the brain keeps us trapped. We've been learning a lot, you know, as James taught last week, about how the emotional brain is only looking at the short term and wants to keep us trapped in a way of being that often doesn't serve us. That's an architecture working against us, because then the rational brain has visions for what's possible. We all have visions for what's possible. When Matt was teaching about the building that he built in Italy and designed in Italy, this started as an idea that then becomes something that is possible and becomes manifested in physical space. All of our lives are ideas that become manifested in physical space. In other words, there's no distinction whether you're working with wood and steel or whether you're working with the cells of your body in terms of what gets created. We are all architects, so to speak, of our own life.
Or whether you're a team of 20 people doing a piece of software.
Right, the software, right? Yeah. Matt and I have been working on trying to get a project off the ground for the better part of 2 years. Rita's familiar with this, to create the classroom that ought to be for the education system. And we have to pay attention to the fact that there are both physical and virtual spaces now, speaking of computer systems, that constitute classrooms. And these are complex systems of human beings who have different motivations. The architecture of your life is what we have in our lives as individuals on this journey together inside the being experiment, has been what we've been spending the better part of 3 weeks now talking about. Think of your friends, think of your family, think of your coworkers, and then think of the physical environments that you live in. What are the implications of all of these elements? My encouragement,
when you meet those people, when you dialogue with those people, whether you like them or not, whether you fight with them or not, whether you love them or not, that experience never leaves. That experience is connected to many, many, many neural nets inside your mind. And when you get into a certain area, you pull that experience, you pull those people back. And if you look at quantum mechanics and the process where they shot the two little objects in opposite direction and they changed one at the last moment, when the other one went through the slot, it changed to twice the speed of light, which is supposed to be impossible.
Right.
When you look at modern science is now rapidly breaking down all of those old barriers and realizing that there's nothing that's not connected and constant. Once brought together, they call it entanglement, becomes entangled at any scale from brain to universe. And so this is really important because, you know, when Chad was talking about the emotional brain sometimes, you know, holding you back, well, that's probably why we're still alive, because that's the conservative part that says, you know, before you stick your head out of this cave, you better find out if there's, you know, a tiger out there or a really bad mammoth that you almost tried to kill yesterday and he's pissed off. At the same time, if you stayed in the cave, you're going to die. And so we have these different systems which are context sensitive and pull together, and we can't force them, we can't even train them, but we do have that executive routine that becomes aware what's in here, aware what's out there, what's going back and forth. And the executive routine can make certain kinds of decisions. As example, you can go anywhere tomorrow on this planet, fly 20 hours, go to bed, and if you say to yourself, I will wake up at 6 a.m., you will. Now, if you say, I'd kind of like to, the response back here might be, well, I'd kind of like to hear, but I'm tired, screw you. But if you say, I will, you will wake up. There's a certain level where we can program our own system. Dr. Lilly talked about programming and metaprogramming in the human biocomputer. It's only part of the system. When you read a book, you are really programming. You can either read it like this, or you can dive into it and get into it and let it just come in without judgment, and then read it from the standpoint of, if I take these ideas and add it to these ideas and what I did last week, and I did that 20 years ago and 30 years ago, my golly, I could build this, or I could do this. Now you're engaging, you know, How to Read a Book, the famous book. You're now engaging the author as a person and engaging that knowledge and information that's in that book, and then forming a model and testing it. Rather than saying, well, wait a minute, where'd you go to school? How do I know that what you're telling me about quantum physics is right? Play suppose. That's one of the models. Suppose it's true. What would it be? What would that mean? Well, I don't want to jump off a cliff on a suppose that I might learn to fly in 30 seconds, but I could run other kinds of tests to find out whether a human could fly. I might build an airplane.
Hmm. And that's where I want to kind of, as we wrap up in a few minutes here, this is, like I said, part one of a two-part, which I'm going to personally pick up, and we're going to actually just have a full-on conversation in April. But what I'd like everyone to do between now and then, as we continue with this architecture and environment, I believe Anurag is going to be teaching next week on continuing to deep dive into this conversation. I'd like everyone to take a book, as Matt's suggesting, and start to give yourself some space to reflect on who you're being, cognitively, emotionally, physically, the physical spaces you inhabit, spiritually. What are your values and belief systems? What is underlying and driving you and me as well? I'm doing the same exercise, you know, us. Who are we being at any moment, and what is the architecture of that being? It's these four elements. And start to try to get to develop an awareness of these different four aspects and document it. And then come back to it in a week, and then come back to it in a month, and see if it's consistent. See if you're happy with it. See if there are things or elements that you would like to change about your cognitive architecture, your physical architecture, your emotional architecture, your spiritual architecture. Remember when we started the Being Experiment in January, I made the statement that that our lives and who we are being is either created by default through our unconscious ways of being, or we have consciously designed it. And very few people have consciously designed their beingness as a human being. We tend to live our lives in our society right now as human doings. In other words, it's like, what do you do? Well, this is what I do. And we judge each other and we evaluate each other based on what we are individually doing, but not who we're being. We pay very little attention to who we're being. Never mind actually getting into the architecture of what our being is.
And here's the caveat. That's why I threw in the little model of right livelihood. you don't make change directly by imposing, like a dictator, on your body, mind, or your community, something. You come at it another way. If you take something like the right livelihood model, there's lots of good models. And what are the conditions and the knowledge required and the habits? You know, habits are wonderful. You couldn't walk without habits. You know, you develop habits, but habits can become traps when you don't know you have them. But and habits you can always change, because say, I will stop drinking coffee. This is my first cup in a long time, but I was up late last night. And I will do this, I will do that. You can change there. You can look at the conditions that something like that model says, this is the conditions that you need to be aware of, and then let the change come up organically. And don't get on yourself if it takes a little while, because it's like everything else. It doesn't seem to happen. It doesn't seem to happen. It doesn't seem to happen. And suddenly I'm hitting the tennis ball every time. And yet the tennis instructor is going to say, you hold it this way. You swing this way. Don't do this. And stuff like that. And he or she helps you create a set of habits that time has shown makes it easier. And then one day you're just doing it and you're not thinking about it. That's the way to do that. That's the way to design a building. That's why you just don't, draw one thing and run it through the CAD system and go out and build it. The task of designing a simple house for a family, really, and there's very few, really creating a work of art around them, a work of art that includes their aspirations and all their requirements, and is beautiful and makes the land it sits on even more beautiful, and it is sustainable, and it doesn't poison, and stuff like that, is an extraordinarily complex thing to do. Extraordinary. As a matter of fact, on a house that costs under $1 million, the actual time to do that right, the design time is actually probably more expensive than the house if you added up the hours. That's why you don't see many of them. But the point is it's a good model of how we change ourselves, how we challenge our assumptions. Oh my goodness, I didn't go to school, I can't do that. Or I'm a guy and I can't understand that. Or I'm a woman and I can't go into that profession. Or whatever. All of these things that's like garbage that's been piled on top of our civilization that we have to clean up now and challenge.
Yeah. And that's as we wrap up here, that's the objective of this week, is to start to document. We are trying to, as part of the being experiment, another way of saying what we're doing is we're re-engineering and re-architecting ourselves and our lives and who we're being in the context of that. But in order to really understand what we need to alter, documenting and referencing and going back and revisiting and thinking, just like an architect would to build a house, we are the architects of our own life and our own body. And that's the metaphor today. And so as we break for this week, know that we're coming back to this conversation in 2 or 3 weeks. And what I would like everyone to have when we come back in 2 or 3 weeks as part of the discipline and the practices is documenting your physical architecture, that is the physical architecture of where you exist in physical space, your cognitive architecture, what thoughts are you having, limiting beliefs, positive beliefs, potential, what's possible, spiritual architecture. Do you have certain driving value systems, spiritual or otherwise, that are thrusting you forward? And emotional architecture. We just spent a month on emotional sobriety. What's coming up for you? Start documenting all of this. And we're going to come back to this in 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm going to share what I've been documenting. And we're going to have more of a conversation, less of a lecture and more of a conversation about what's been coming up for people. And the work that Anurag is going to lead us through and James in the subsequent weeks between that will help to kind of bring this up. But I'll be reminding everyone on the Facebook group about this. And with that, we will break for the day because we're a few minutes over time. But Matt, thank you so much for your time and for the metaphor this morning to help us kind of think through how this relates to our own lives. And we'll be coming back to this. But in the meantime, everyone, I'm going to be showing up for the Facebook for the breakout group this week, where we can talk more about this and its relationship to our being. And in the meantime, we will break for the day, and I'll see you guys next Sunday if I don't see you on Wednesday at the breakout group. So thanks for your time this morning. Thanks for
fantastic. That was incredible. Thank you, man.
Thanks, Anurag.
Incredible.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Sorry, I ate up the question time.
That's okay.
It was incredible. It was incredible, man. That was amazing. I could just hear you talk for hours.
All right. Well, Anurag should join us on Wednesday if we can make it. Okay, we'll talk. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.